Ladies and gentlemen, who here has, in the past month, eaten a hamburger? Let's see hands. All right. Were you afraid? Did you call your parents to say that you loved them? Since the year 2000, there have been 63,000 deaths caused by foodborne illness in this country. By comparison, since 2000, there have been a little over 3,000 deaths, including the ones that happened on September 11th. There's a big divide here, and yet we're not afraid of hamburgers. I'm not saying that terrorism, defined as the tactic used by stateless organizations of using violence on civilians to achieve policy goals, completely doesn't exist. But I am saying that it's largely a mirage, in that a mirage being defined as a vision or conception of an entity that has the appearance of reality, but is in fact not substantial. And what this really comes down to is the difference between emotional reality and actual reality. Emotional reality is how we conceive of terrorism. We think of names, we think of faces, we think of fear. But in actual reality, the threat of terrorism is very minute. And by actual reality, we're talking about what really affects us, what really affects the world. And terrorism, and terrorism, as this entity, is much more of an emotional threat than a physical one, and is thus not really a threat at all. So I'd like to address the three reasons for this, one of which, the final of which my partner will bring up. First, terrorism is statistically insignificant. Secondly, we have a ridiculous conception of terrorists themselves. And three, the use of terrorism as this concept is used as a rhetoric to oppress peoples internationally and nationally. Yes, sir.
But who are you to judge that emotional harms are less important than physical harms?
Well, I'll explain that now. What I mean by that terrorism is a statistically insignificant way to die. First of all, it's incredibly rare. In terms of the ways that we have to die, lightning strikes, accidental falls, going in a car is far more likely to kill you, and yet we spend so much of our time, effort, and policy directed towards this threat that is not a real physical danger to us. The problem with this approach of acknowledging it as an emotional threat rather than a physical one is that the emotional threats are intangible, while the physical ones are the things that we should be focusing our policy on. And if we go about conceiving of our policies as an emotional one, where we see this big threat of terrorism because it feels big, when really it is a very small thing, we create policies that are tailored to, that are too large, in the same way that you might use a large net to catch small fish when all the small fish go through. A good example of this is how post 9/11 we've invaded 2 countries, we've contributed aid to other countries and corrupt regimes in trying to combat terrorism. We've passed the Patriot Act within this country, and other countries have passed similar measures to censure civil liberties. But when really the reason that the people who committed 9/11 entered this country was because the immigration system for checking their visas was not thorough enough. And when we insist on conceptualizing terrorism as a large threat rather than a small one, we actually fail to fix it. Secondly, we have a ridiculous and unrealistic concept of terrorists themselves. The first thing that we have to realize is that terrorists, by and large, are very bad at terrorism. And what do I mean by this? One of the most recent widely publicized efforts to stop a terrorist attack was the attack in the alleged attack in 2007 of the bombing of the JFK airport that was attempted. The problem with this is that the plan to do so was so flawed that had the terrorists even really gotten to the stage where they could have done it, it wouldn't have worked because they didn't understand how the airport worked. Had they succeeded in bombing the fuel lines, it wouldn't have gone anywhere because they had failed to take into account that the fuel lines would close, not shutting down the airport, not hurting anyone. The fact is that we see this again with this shoe bombing, which is the reason all of us have to remove our shoes every time we go through the airport. But that shoe bomb, it has been revealed, wouldn't have even worked had he gotten it to light. So we treat terrorists as this large threat when really they're fairly bad at doing what they do. Yes, sir.
But your JFK example simply proves that we took really good measures to ensure that if a terrorist attack happens, no one will get hurt.
But if the terrorist attack had happened, no one would have gotten hurt. The terrorists are much more a danger to themselves than they are to anyone in this room. We also think of this as on the international level, we see the terrorist camps with usually a mask and waving anti-American flags. But these people aren't really, don't really have that strong of conviction. They would much rather not fight us had they just had enough to eat. And in this sense, they're not very likely to act against the United States. 9/11 was really an anomaly in that prior to 9/11, most hijackings were characterized by somebody who wanted to take the plane for a political reason, put it somewhere else, and if you didn't make any trouble, you'd be fine. But in reality, it wasn't a well-orchestrated plan. It was an anomaly, and I don't think that we have to fear these anomalies, especially when we spend almost too much time dealing with the problem that doesn't really exist, as my partner will bring up. So the question here is, if it isn't real, like we're suggesting, if the threat of terrorism isn't real, then why do we feel it's real? And the reason that we feel it is real is because of this emotional reality that I talked about before. That we hear the names and we see the faces of the people who have been killed, and we identify. But we have to, everyone in this room, I would encourage you throughout this debate to not go with your gut, but to think about the issues as they impact us, as they impact the world, as they impact reality as it is. And in this way, I beg you to agree with the affirmative. Thank you. Show me your credentials.
Yep.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you one thing. Terrorism is real. It's very real. My opponent claims that it is nothing but a mirage. He claims that it is not real. A mirage is something we see in the distance, and when we come upon it, we see that there's nothing actually there. There's nothing there. I am here to tell you that there is something there. There are people here to kill us. Now, I agree with my opponent's definition. Terrorists are non-state actors who attack civilians for the purpose of fear. He's right. But for him to say that terrorism is statistically insignificant is appalling. He's telling me that it doesn't matter if people die. It doesn't matter if our family members die. It doesn't matter if our friends die. Because only a few people died, we should do nothing, in the opinion of my opponent. This is absurd and almost insulting.
Sir?
Second, he says it's an unrealistic concept. My opponent claims that terrorists are bad at terrorism. Well, they did a pretty good job of crashing planes into buildings. They did a pretty good job of hijacking planes, bombing the Marine barracks in Lebanon. They did a pretty good job. Why did we stop them? It's not because they were bad. It's because we were good. It's because we were determined. We stood up and we said no. And we stopped them. Because we stopped them, they couldn't harm people. My argument is that terrorism is real. And there are 3 points to my argument. There are the cost of lives. That is the most important part. It almost seems a shame that I have to mention this in the same breath as the cost of lives, but I must. The cost in dollars. And third, there's the cost on our everyday lives. The cost of the fear that these terrorists have imposed upon us that we have to deal with and how we go about our everyday. That my partner will address. First, the cost of lives. Richard Dennis Allen, Douglas J. Stone, Margaret L. Benson, David S. Barry. These are just a few people that I would love to ask if terrorism is a mirage, but I can't. They're gone, killed by terrorists. Yes?
What about those that have died in the name of freedom and security?
I'm afraid those weren't terrorist acts. Those were government state actors. By your definition, that's not terrorist acts. So, I'm sorry.
But it's still dead.
In 9/11, over 3,000 people died. At the U.S. Embassy bombings in Nairobi, Kenya, and Tanzania, 212 people died and over 5,000 people were wounded. At the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, 168 people were killed and over 600 were wounded. Those are real costs, and those are costs in lives, and those are real. You cannot deny that people died. That is not a mirage. Second, and like I said, it almost seems a shame that I have to say this in the same breath as the cost of lives, but I have to. It's the cost of money. In the immediate after September 11th, 200,000 people lost their jobs. That's 200,000 families who no longer had an income in which to rely upon. 200,000 families who had to go home and say, how do I feed my children? Yes?
And isn't that because the country saw terrorism as a big threat and had to shut down rather than seeing it as a small threat that they could go on living their lives for?
No, I'm afraid that's simply not true. The fact of the matter is, buildings were destroyed. Places of business were destroyed. Companies were destroyed. Their jobs were gone. Second, $27.2 billion were taken from the United States and the people by these terrorist attacks. That's how much it cost because of these attacks. And what about the medium to long-range impacts? What about our industries? Airlines, tourism, shipping. First of all, the airlines. People were afraid to fly. Jobs were lost. A major American industry was harmed severely. Tourism. People were afraid to travel. People were afraid to fly. There was no way for these people were too afraid to get on a plane to go abroad. This is a major industry for America. Thus were millions of dollars lost. Shipping. The cost to ship. The increase in insurance. Whether to fly their cargo, whether to ship their cargo. Would their cargo be destroyed? They could never know. And finally, our response, the U.S. government's response. You can't tell me that after September 11th, people were not afraid. People were afraid. Our government had to respond. This meant increased security. This meant invading Afghanistan. These were just a few steps that were taken that were demanded by the public. This had to be done. In short, I'm here to tell you, terrorism is not a mirage. I can go to the graves of the people who have lost their lives, and I can look at the lives taken from us and say, that is real. That is real. Money. It's almost a shame, but money, yes, money. Billions of dollars harmed to American industries. Jobs taken. These are real. These are not a mirage. Thank you very much. Oh, it's a time.
High five.
Ready? I'd first like to begin with a little refutation of what the first opposition has spoken about. You know, his 3 points here were cost of life, right? And in a point of information, I asked, you know, what about those that have died in the name of freedom and security? And apparently to him, those lives didn't matter because they happened not to fall under the definition of terrorism. But I'm here to tell you that they are still lives. And they are lives that are being lost in the name of terrorism and security. You know, the government has used this rhetoric in order to oppress people, a point which I will go into later. And second, you know, he mentions this idea of the economic costs. And to this I say, what about the $500 billion that has been spent on the Iraq War? That far outweighs any amount of money that could have been lost in any particular instance of terrorism. And in addition, he mentions, you know, the cost of everyday lives. And with this, I have to agree with him. You know, he says the fear of flight, the fear of tourism, all of these fears. And who causes these fears but the American government? They are instilling this fear in the people. And so to this, I say the answer is less fear, not more fear, not the promotion of fear by the government, but less fear of a threat that, as my partner has proven, is much less substantial than the government and this opposition team would like you to believe. We see the faces of those that have been killed in 9/11. How could we not? But what we don't see is the countless bodies that were rendered lifeless due to the off-target bombings in Iraq. How many people were killed when the United States government indiscriminately dropped white phosphorus in Fallujah? These deaths are far more real than any abstract threat of terrorism could ever be. The United States government has used the rhetoric of terrorism to oppose peoples, to oppress peoples both nationally and internationally. In the practical world, this argument has three-point structures. You have national oppression, international oppression, and the U.S. funding of other governments' oppression. The first point begins as such. The passing of the Patriot Act in the wake of 9/11. This act affects our daily lives. I can no longer buy certain types of cold medicine at a store because I don't carry a driver's license. I know a minor instance, but it sucks, you know. I got a cold and it's really a pain in the ass. Monitoring library book selections. Now I have the government ability to spy on what it is that I take out, and this to me seems completely illogical and totally unrelated to the threat of terrorism itself. And on top of it, you have something called the no-fly list, which I thought was really amusing, is that little Edward Allen, a 4-year-old Jamaican boy, was unable to visit his grandparents because he somehow managed to get himself on this no-fly list. But yes, sir, you seem to think it's necessary.
Is your convenience more important than American lives?
Now, I would like to just think about this question itself, my convenience. My convenience is hindered by this fear, this abstract fear in terror. So his question itself feeds into my point. Now, back onto the Patriot Act. You have more substantial impacts. You know, I kid about cold medicine, but think about what this does in practice. It authorizes the use of lethal force. Okay, it suspends habeas corpus in certain instances, and it also sanctions certain forms of torture. Now, these have very real-world consequences, which lead me into my second point.
Before that.
Yes, sir.
But this only proves that the American government is somewhat stupid, not that the threat of terrorism is a mirage.
Well, I may not disagree with you on that particular point. I still feel that it's important to analyze the American government's response to the threat of terrorism itself. Now, the point of international oppression. We've all heard about the detainees in Guantanamo Bay. But how many of you know that some of these detainees range in age from 12 to 14? Okay, what 12-year-old could have done something that has put him or her on this terrorist threat list and allow them to be exported from their country and placed under conditions in a secretive prison for which America really doesn't know what's even happening there. Another fact that is rarely publicized is the number of innocent Iraqi civilians that have been killed by mercenary groups such as Blackwater. These groups are employed by the American government, and because they are not classified as military actors, the countless deaths go unreported, and so there's really no way of knowing how many people have died because of American-employed mercenary groups. Now, on to my third point here. You have, since the September 11th attacks, the U.S. government has provided funding to people like General Pervez Musharraf, the now leader of Pakistan, this man has, in the name of fighting terrorism, killed countless numbers of his own people. Today he is largely viewed as a dictator and a major stumbling block toward the democratic development in Pakistan today. And let me remind you that this point is as much about what we are not doing as what we are. 100,000 troops have been deployed into Iraq, but not a single soldier has been sent into the Sudan to stop the genocide that is occurring in the Darfur region. Now, simply to summarize my points here, we've analyzed how rare terrorism actually occurs. We've also talked about how ineffective most of these terrorist cells are in common practice. I believe, colloquially, my partner spoke as how stupid most of these people are. They can't go through with their plans. And third, that this has been used by the United States government to oppress people nationally and internationally. And it's for these reasons that I beg you to affirm the resolution. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm not here to cook, here to argue. It's lovely that we brought that up. So, what I'm going to do is start by giving you my main argument that I'm going to be presenting this evening. Ostensibly, that's that there is a measurable cost to the quality of our lives that is, there's a measurable cost to the quality of our lives that is affected by terrorism. And then I'm going to go on to refute the arguments of the second speaker and highlight the arguments of the first speaker on my side. So, let's see. The first government would have you believe that terrorism is rare. Rare. Uncommon. Doesn't happen frequently. Okay? Ask anyone in Israel who lives their life daily in fear. No thank you. If terrorism is rare. Okay? Ask anyone, no thank you, anyone in Iraq living in Baghdad right now who experiences daily roadside bombings, daily market suicide bombings, if terrorism is rare. Yes, ma'am.
But it was exactly war on terrorism excuse to start the war in Iraq.
Whether or not terrorism was the reason we went to war in Iraq is irrelevant as to whether or not terrorism is real. What I'm here to argue today is that terrorism is real. And if we chose to spend $34 billion in Iraq to fight an unreal threat, probably not. Excuse me, I didn't say that the best. Would we spend $34 billion in Iraq to fight a threat that wasn't there? I think not. Okay? Talk about America as a seat of power in the modern world. You think we do not have the resources to investigate whether or not threats are actualized? I think we do.
I think there's a reason that our American soldiers are dying in Iraq. I think there's a reason we're spending that kind of money. It's to prevent further attacks on our native soil or abroad. Yes, sir.
Sir, is it that you think that there's a reason or that you feel there's a reason?
I think that I know a reason, but I like the fact that you brought up the feeling, because that leads me to my next point of refutation. You spoke that, let me see if I can find the quote here. This is an emotional threat, not a real threat. Is that to say that our feelings aren't real? Is that to say that it doesn't affect us if on a daily basis we have to adjust the quality of our own lives to accept the reality of terrorism? No, thank you. And yeah, maybe as the average American, we don't sit at our home and think about, you know, whether or not we're going to be safe in our daily lives. But I can tell you of some specific terrorist threats that do affect our daily lives. What happened when the Columbine shootings happened? I'd like to categorize that as a terrorist attack, okay? That's a minority lashing out at a larger, no thank you, superior majority, all right? It was one disgruntled young man lashing out against his schoolmates, okay? Let's take the example of the Oklahoma City bombings, okay? These are threats but perpetrated by Americans on American soil against other Americans. You know, what government official went to work the next day and didn't think about, am I safe in my workplace? Terrorist threats are real, no thank you. They have an effect. They're far-reaching. They reach into your homes and into your hearts, and they touch all of you. No thank you. Let's see. Now, they talked about a minimalized risk of bodily harm, okay? If bodily harm is truly minimalized, what says you to all the people who've been wounded by suicide bombings? When a suicide bomb goes off, you can have 80 people who are wounded. What if you lose an arm or a leg? Is that not bodily harm? What about the 3,000 people who ended up in body bags as a result of September 11th? Did they not experience bodily harm? I think that no thank you. The arguments of the government are clearly trying to lead you away from the clear and relevant point that whether or not terrorist threats is an emotional threat or an actual physical threat, it's still a threat. They are using fear as a weapon, and that weapon is effective as long as you feel it. No thank you. I'm going to go on to my argument. It's a measurable cost in the quality of life. Because terrorism uses fear as a weapon, we had September 11th, okay? That spread widespread panic across the United States, which had a lot of far-reaching effects. Some of them economic, some of them social. It prompted us into a war, which has costed a lot of American lives. But it was enough of a threat that our country led us there. We have, no thank you, we have suicide bombings, okay? This is a method of spreading fear. If you feel like you walk into your local marketplace and you're not safe buying things, you know, or you feel like you can't go into a nightclub or something, it disturbs your quality of life. And it spreads the message. Whatever message that terrorist is trying to bring, whatever thing he's trying to destabilize, he effectively does it. The taking of hostages. You're going to tell me 11 people in a room on their hands and knees with a gun to the back of their head are not afraid? You're telling me that seeing this broadcast in the media does not spread fear? Does not affect populaces? This is real, and these things happening today are real. The fear of travel is real. Are you safe to go abroad? Are you safe to travel to the Middle East? May you be taken hostage? Possibly. Do any of you feel comfortable traveling there? Do you feel comfortable as Americans in the world? Maybe not. The undeniable economic decline is irrefutable. And the impact of the necessity of retaliation and the resultant loss of life and spending, I think, are also very strong points that point to the realism of terrorism. I think we can count on our government to at least be rational and educated enough to make the kinds of decisions we need to not lead us into a war blindly. That's all I have to say about that. I urge you to oppose. Thank you very much.
discussion needs to be about violence, about how violence is wrong, about how killing innocent people is wrong. Problem is that when you say that killing innocent people at the World Trade Center is evil and wrong, but killing people in Afghanistan when you bomb a wedding celebration is acceptable, and it's collateral damage, and, well, sometime you make mistakes. When you rationalize two different kinds of violence in that way, you perpetuate the problem of violence. And I'm here to tell you that we need to realize that there are root causes of violence: oppression, injustice, racism, denying people a homeland. All of these things are root causes of violence. The war on terrorism and the construct of the term terrorism does not allow us to deal with the root causes. And it also actually increases violence. We think if you want a world with less violence, you're going to agree with us that we need to reject the construct of terrorism and focus on the construct of violence. Now for a little refutation on their arguments. They say terrorism has cost lives. I'm going to show you in a minute that focus on terrorism increases violence and costs many more lives. He says there have been costs in dollars. My God, $22 billion. Your grandchildren are going to be paying for the Iraq War. It's cost $500 billion so far. And the 9/11 Commission said that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Even Bush had to admit it, but oh, every time Bush or Cheney talk about the Iraq War, they mention struggle against terrorism. But the Joint Chiefs of Staff concluded that after the invasion of Iraq, it's become a haven and a breeding ground for terrorists, only making it worse. Then our last speaker talks about our everyday lives and how terrible it is. Yeah, the leaders used it as a reason to create a climate of fear so they can do a bunch of other stuff they want to meet their priorities. Oil, profits for Halliburton, huge profits, overcharges on Halliburton's part, and Cheney used to be on the board of directors. We don't see a war on auto safety or car accidents or food poisoning or lightning strikes because that doesn't meet the agenda of the leaders that we currently have, who I'm glad they agree are stupid.
Yes, sir.
Further proving our point. Is it an emotional threat? Yeah, because the media and the leaders have made you fearful of it. That's why Columbine, perhaps he's unaware that school violence in America is at an all-time low. Fewer students are damaged or killed in schools than at any time in American history. Why does he think it's so bad? The media told him so. They were there with their cameras. The 9/11 Commission concluded that Iraq had nothing to do with it, and yet we had to go into Iraq anyway. Sir?
Are you saying our American disgust that September 11th was actually an emotional response and not a real happening?
I'd say if there would have been a brief emotional response, like after the Oklahoma City bombing, and that's fine. We grieve for violence. We hate it when innocent people are killed, but it wasn't justified to invade Iraq and have a global war on terrorism to fight terrorists, because it only makes it worse, as I'm going to get into in a minute. Our team has said some pretty smart things, right? That it's statistically insignificant. You oppose needless death, then why don't we have a war on these kinds of things instead of on terrorism, which I'll show only makes things worse. They're bad at it, right? They're bad at it. It wasn't that we were smart and caught them. They're bad at it. Remember, they're very bad at it when you hear the rest of the team, the rest of the opposition's arguments. And as Joe just mentioned, it's been abused by policy. right? You know, people have agreed to die for freedom, for democracy, for human rights. Okay? So what has the war on terrorism made us? We become a torturing, library snooping, arresting without cause, free speech infringing society. We are sacrificing the rights we supposedly hold dear. The argument I would like to make is that the construct of terrorism increases violence. It increases violence. It is counterproductive. It only makes things worse. Consider these 4 reasons. First, it increases fear on the part of the population, thus legitimizing violent responses. Fear of 9/11, it was used to cause the invasion of Iraq, which has killed over 10,000 Americans, far outweighing those who died in 9/11. Second, violent response against terrorism stiffens the resolve of those we may think of as terrorists. The war rhetoric justifies terrorism, counterterrorism, terrorism, violence, retaliation, revenge. We have to break that cycle. Support for a war on terrorism solidifies support for attacks that increasingly aim at civilian targets. More civilians have been killed in Afghanistan by Americans than were killed in 9/11. It halts the real discussion of why terrorist acts have taken place. Instead of focusing on injustice and the fact that Palestinians don't have a homeland and oppression, what do? We focus on terrorism, oil, and Halliburton profits. We all want to decrease violence. Let's focus on violence. Let's focus on oppression, injustice, racism, not the construct of terrorism. The construct of terrorism stops us from having a real approach to this. How many terrorist attacks have there been in Israel in the last year? One. And yet the war on terrorism continues there unabated. It's not about stopping violence. It needs to be. The war on terrorism is an excuse for another wrong agenda.
They made us sacrifice our civil liberties. They made us spend millions and millions of dollars. They keep us in constant fear. I mean, you have to give it to these stupid terrorists that apparently do not have a clue of what they're doing and are so ineffective in what they are trying to achieve for them to achieve the current state of being in today's world. The current state when each and every one of us practically fears for our own lives at a certain point in our day. I mean, as far as the government team line goes, it's because people have died, and it's because not enough people have died. Terrorism is not a threat. What I'm going to deal with in my speech are 2 major fallacies on the side of the government team. The first one being that they evaluate threat on past events when threat is always targeted into the future. The second thing I'm going to talk about is that they portray bodily harm to our life when our lives are ended as the only measurable and the only important harm, and we disagree with that. Then I am going to go on to the extension. You want to hear some constructive matters, sir, first. Then I'm going to go on to the extension of the government team, and then I'm going to present you with our extension facing the real threat, actually presenting the threat that we should consider. So what the government says is that it's not a threat because in the past, so many people have died. But when we look at threat, and as we will in the extension of the opposition team, we always have to face the future. And basically what the government says, it's because nothing has happened so far, it's because we have decreased the amount of terrorist attacks after 9/11. That is why terrorism is not a threat. But I urge you to consider the fact that if we wouldn't have treated terrorism as a threat after 9/11, would it still mean that we would face a decrease in attack? Because, I mean, common sense kind of urges me to believe, no thank you, that because we have acknowledged terrorism as a big threat, we have been so successful in tackling it. And that is why we are facing a decrease in terrorist attacks. No thank you. The second fallacy on the side of the government team, which I find abhorrent, is that they say the only thing that matters is when a person dies. It doesn't matter where the terrorists, which, as far as I'm concerned, by definition, means that they try to induce terror, are so successful in achieving their goals. We have to change each and every aspect of our lives that is not a significant harm. No thank you. That when terrorists who are trying to induce terror are actually successful in inducing that terror, are named stupid and incompetent. It seems that the government defines something, then proves that these people achieve this, and shows this as not being a consequence. Now let's get, no thank you sir, to the extension of the government team. They say that the term terrorism induces more violence. That when we talk about terrorism, this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, let's take a look at two things first. If it has become a self-fulfilling prophecy, if the term terrorism causes more terrorism, that inherently proves that terrorism is real, that it is a real threat. Because if we create more terrorism with the use of the concept of terrorism, that makes terrorism not so much real as increasing, as that we are creating it, thus it has to be real. Furthermore, when we mark terrorism as a mirage, we do not get rid of the concept of terrorism. The concept of terrorism still remains. So the government's goal of identifying terrorism as a mirage does not solve anything. What we argue is it makes it worse, because it mystifies the whole term, the whole concept of terrorism, which further makes people believe that this is something that is out of our reach, that it is something we cannot tackle, that we cannot deal with, thus making it a greater harm to our lives. Now let's look at the harm, at the threat, as it's supposed to be looked at into the future. Not so long ago, the Central Intelligence Agency of your country has found a great amount of plans in Afghanistan's caves, which presumably were aimed at New York. The plans considered the terrorists stealing nuclear waste, which is not a hard thing to do since it's practically lying around unprotected, no thank you sir, and making a dirty bomb out of it. And just consider the consequences of blowing up 1 kilogram of nuclear waste in central New York. This would make the whole 1/3 of one of America's most important cities practically uninhabitable. Yes, sir.
Again, sir, you're using the rhetoric of fear to scare the audience.
No, I'm not using the rhetoric of fear. Okay, there are people in Afghanistan which have taken little pieces of paper, drawn plans on them, and what's written on these pieces of paper is that they're going to think a thing that is harmful or that might harm people, other nice people, and put it in New York. And then when this thing is going to spread around New York, like bees go when they go hunting for honey, then it will cause more people to harm. So with nice words, I hope you didn't get afraid right now. So another thing I would like to point at is an article that was written a couple of years ago, and it basically states that if there was only one single nuclear attack on the United States because of the preemptive attack policy, what would happen is, and I quote, a chain reaction of interstate nuclear conflict that could ensure a war that would ultimately involve the superpowers or even every nuclear weapon state. So what we are arguing here is that terrorism is a threat in the sense that if only one attack happens, it is simply too much damage, and that is why we should never take risks. Nuclear power plants are statistically less harmful than terrorist attacks. Yes, we still take much more safety measures in making them safe. So what does that do with the government's logic? Thank you.
The opposition is trying to sell you a false dichotomy. Either you fight the terrorists, go to war, go to Iraq, either you die, you are killed by the terrorists. This is the rhetorics that the opposition uses. This is the rhetorics that the media uses. This is the rhetorics that Bush uses. We believe, and we appeal to you as the future scholars, that you stop being addressed by these rhetorics and re-examine the claims under them. And the claims under them are basically the claims that call for war, that call for some nonsense fight. And that's why we're proud to stand on the side of the government. Now basically this debate boils down to three major questions and issues of today's debate. Firstly, I'll be talking about terrorism and its victims. Secondly, I'll be talking about the possibility of nuclear war, something that Filip was talking about. And thirdly, I'll be talking about the spin-offs of war on terrorism or fighting terrorists. Now, let me go to the first issue. Let me talk about terrorism and its victims. Now, the opposition stands up and says, well, we have names. Well, we have bodies. And sure, we agree that you have names. And we totally agree that some people have died because of terrorism. But at the end of the day, we see that the fear of terrorism is overblown. And it justifies some things that are simply unjust. Now, basically, our first government talked about how compared to other threats, terrorism is simply overblown and minor. We do not fight, for example, food lackages or when you get damaged by food. Or we don't fight, for example, car accidents, even though they're far more greater than the threat of terrorism. And that's why you have to, at the end of the day, compare what is greater threat of terrorism or other threats. And we see the threat of terrorism as minor. No, but then they go on and say, well, but if not that big of a threat in bodies, well, what about the emotional threat? Now, here again, we see that the emotional threat is overblown, and it's overblown by media and Bush rhetorics. Now, so what they say is basically, well, what about our lives? Well, what about that people don't feel secure? But it's not because of the terrorists at the end of the day. It's because of the media. It's because of your president that wants to justify his war in Iraq. Well, that's unjust. That's immoral. No, thank you. Now, what about the money that we lose because of terrorists? But then again, we pointed out that it's not terrorists. It's your reply, your insufficient reply to the terrorists and your war on terrorism that's losing you money, that makes you spend more money on war and terrorism than social security. No, thank you, Filip. Now, Filip then goes on and presents his futuristic vision about talking about, well, because of everything we did on 9/11, that's why we didn't have all the terrorist attacks we otherwise would have. But let me just say something. Because of the U.S. response on 9/11, anti-Americanism grew up. Number of terrorist organizations grew up. Number of terrorists in Afghanistan and Iraq went up. So it's this insufficient response that makes you basically fear. So at the end of the day, your terrorizer is not the terrorist, but the U.S. government. No, thank you. Let me go on to to the second point, and this is the point Filip was talking about, the nuclear war. And we accused him that basically he is using the rhetorics of fear, and he made fun out of it. Yes, Filip, make fun out of it.
What rhetorics will you want me to use when people crash planes into building and other innocent people die? How am I to express death without the use of that word?
Well, with reason is how we propose on the government, with sufficient and reasonable measurements, and not just to appeal to the majority. Now, basically, what they say on the opposition is, you have paper, you have plan, you have bomb, you have New York, kaboom. Now, what we say is, firstly, we have nuclear bombs for 50 years. We have many of these plans for nuclear war or terrorist nuclear attacks, and none of them happened. Further on, they did not give us a plan. How would these terrorists actually get to the nuclear waste or nuclear bombs? Well, just because they wrote it down on the paper. And that's why we believe it's just not sufficiently enough for us to believe that this nuclear war would happen. Now, further on, they say, well, okay, but if it happens, the US will respond severely. Firstly, we ask you, well, how will they know who to respond to if we're talking about terrorists, if we're talking about illegal small organizations just coming to your country and bombing themselves? Well, will they just bomb Afghanistan? Will they just bomb, for example, Syria? And at the end of the day, I'm quite sure they will do that. But again, it will not be the problem of the terrorists. It will be the problem of the US government doing the atrocious acts, doing the terrorist acts. Now, and this leads me to the third issue I want to talk about. And these are the spin-offs of war on terrorism and fight against terrorists. And this is the problem, the major issue we talked about on the side of the government. How today we are basically making excuses for the atrocious acts our government is doing. Now we said that basically it's wrong to talk about terrorism as a notion because there is violence, and we agree that some people do violence. But when you call them terrorists, you group them, and you group them in a way that firstly dehumanizes them. Secondly, it creates fear, and thirdly, it makes excuses for all the atrocious acts you yourself do or your government does. So basically, because today's war on terror is Mirage, because it makes us forget about the principles we stand on, and because it's not that bad, and for sure it's smaller than the threat that your own country is posing upon you, we are proud to stand on the side that says, wake up, listen to the sound of reality, and not just the side of appeal to the masses. Thank you. You can go. Yeah.
Some of you in this room, I've talked about the fear of speaking, and some of us have talked about it in great detail. And I will say that one of the things not to do is definitely don't start your day with too much coffee. Don't forget to eat, and maybe even eat a hamburger. Because in the end, the fear of speaking is definitely an emotional fear, but it changes how we act because it feels real. But the difference between fearing speaking and fearing terrorism is that only one is proven to kill you. And what I intend to prove is that everyone on the government bench has conceded the argument that terrorism is not a mirage, which means that by sidestepping all of the issues, they've handed us the debate. In fact, in the last speech, we heard the government whip tell us that the number of terrorist groups is increasing. If that's true, how can it be a mirage? I think this debate centers on 3 points of clash. We're going to talk about 3 things. The first thing we're going to speak about is the ethics of the war on terror, or the idea of killing civilians, the Bush administration policy of preemptive war. The second point of clash is the question of, is it real? And I'm doing the government a favor by calling this a point of clash. And the third point that we're going to discuss is the framework or rhetoric that we use to understand terrorism is the most important thing. So to begin, let's start with the ethics of the war on terrorism. Dr. Snider gave a great speech about the ethics of the Bush administration, about the ethics of the Halliburton Corporation, about the tragedy that is the war in Iraq, about the lives lost in Afghanistan, about collateral damage and the way that we use that term to justify the killing of innocent civilians. But this, sir, is not the key question in this debate. The question is not how should we deal with terrorism. The question is terrorism a mirage? I'll come to you in a second. The question is also not, is the Iraq War a bad idea? This whole discussion of the ethics of the Bush administration have nothing to do with whether or not terror is real. They have to do with the question of how people have used that construct, which is not the key question in this debate. And the question is most definitely not, what do we do with the construct, but is the construct real and worth doing something or anything about, and we will contend that it is. So even if you think the Bush administration is the worst thing ever, it is not relevant to this debate. And we all know that Bush may not always have the best ideas. In fact, his logic of using a bigger hammer to make things fit obviously causes problems in more areas than just the war on terrorism. But that is irrelevant to the question of whether or not it's real that people lost their lives on 9/11, or whether or not it's real that people died in Oklahoma City, or whether or not it's real that people died in Kenya, or whether or not it's real that people died in Spain, or any of the other places where terrorist attacks have happened. That is the key question, is did those things happen, and is it something we need to do anything about, regardless of if we have Bush, because he's only going to be in office for a short time.
Sir?
Yes.
We're not denying that people at 9/11 died. We're denying that it was not sufficient to justify all the wars on terror that the Bush administration did.
That's a fascinating question. And arguing the legitimacy or the merits of the Bush administration's use of the construct of terrorism has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not that construct is a mirage. In fact, that brings me to the second point of clash in this debate. And that is it real? I thought I was going to spend a lot more time here, but it got a lot easier after the last speech. In fact, the government concedes it's real. The only question they say is how we deal with it, which is not relevant. Maja says that numbers of terrorist groups have been growing since 9/11. Numbers of terrorist groups have been growing in Iraq. Now, we could have the chicken or egg debate. Well, did troops when we occupied Iraq create more terrorists, or were there terrorists there first? And we could have that debate all day. But guess what? People die every day in Iraq from improvised explosive devices. Those things are real. Soldiers are losing their lives now. It's not a question of how the construct created something. It's a question of what we deal with right now. Those people are dead. And the government fails to address the argument that Filip makes in his last speech, which is if this argument about constructs is true, all it says is that by talking about terrorism, we create a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, guess what? That proves that it's real because the prophecy has come true and terrorism is a real threat that we have to deal with. Yes, sir.
And isn't it that we are in Iraq, and isn't it that all that is happening because people listen to your side of the table that said that this is a far larger threat than it is?
I understand that you're still caught up in the chicken or the egg debate, but that is not what we're here to discuss. The question is it real now, and how do we address it when we get this guy out of the White House? Now, the last point of clash... Do you have a timer? Because I didn't start it.
2 minutes.
Okay, the last point of clash is a question of what framework do we approach this issue with, or what rhetoric do we use? And here's the important question. What the hell do I call a non-state actor who attacks civilians in my country? What is the name for that? Maybe you have an idea.
Criminal. Violent criminal.
I agree, and maybe we should attach the word terrorist so that we have a unique category to punish people for crimes of that magnitude. Now, no thank you. What we need, and something that's been ignored by the government bench, is a future vision. The chicken or egg debate, discussing whether or not terrorism was real and whether or not we created it, is less relevant than what the hell are we going to do about it, because we need to understand it's real. It's 2008, and people need to wake up. Access to fissile material is possible in a world of crumbling states, and especially of crumbling nuclear states. Terrorists can get fissile material, but more than that, they can get radioactive material to make dirty bombs. If one attack like this happened, if someone stole a vial of a biological agent or a chemical agent and set it off in New York City or Los Angeles, that would spark a full-scale assault by the United States because of the policies that the Bush administration has, and this is not something we can risk. We can't make it go away, and we need to not pretend like it doesn't exist. What we need is a strategy to deal with it, and even if the current administration has a failure to come up with a good strategy, that dodges the question. Discussion of that ethical question of what the Bush Doctrine is about and whether or not preemptive war is a good idea dodges the question of whether or not terrorism is real. And if you believe that people are dying in Iraq now, if you believe that what happened at 9/11 really happened, if you believe that what happened in Oklahoma City before Bush was ever in office was a terrorist attack, then I beg you to oppose.
Oh, what a handshake.
Yeah. All right, we're going to serve some refreshments. If you'd like to stay and talk to any of the debaters, please feel free to do so. And thank you for coming.
If you're in my class, make sure you signed in with Marty so that you get credit.
Good job. Nice job.
Partner.
Shake my hand.
Where's the food?
Yeah, I have that one.
There's some in the back here. Why don't we move our notes and lay it out? Yeah.
Oh wait, no, we got drinks.
I can't believe you're trying to force me to deny that anyone died tonight.
Yeah, that was your point at the end of the speech.
Yeah, for real.
I'm just going to back
What happened to the rest of the food? Where are the drinks? What's up, Dave?
Where's Jacob? Jacob took the drinks.
Jacob, where's the drinks? What?
Drinks.
Instead of
Sorry for not accepting. I had a lot of stuff to do.
yeah, that was Mirage.
I really wanted to. If you would have given me one later,
Terrorism is a self-prophecy. Because pretty much all the other.
What happened to the sodas?
Where's Jacob? Oh, I asked him to bring
Jacob!
I know that.
What do you got?
did you turn the camera off?
Still going?